All right, we're back on the show, hitting the home stretch. Now we can relax.
Well, for a second, and then we're going to talk about some pretty tense things, right? So
I'm still going to relax.
Okay.
We got Kevin Annett joining us here. Kevin, it's been tough to schedule you actually getting in here, but here you are.
It's good to be here, always.
And the funny thing was, I was telling you that last night I was out with this guy, Rob from California, and he said, "Do you know Kevin Annett?" And I go, "Yeah, he's going to be on the show tomorrow."
What, it just came out of nowhere?
Yeah.
That's crazy synchronicity, man.
I know.
Either that or someone's following Kevin.
I don't know why that would happen.
Oh. Okay, Kevin, so let's get into it. You got the new book. Do you want to hold that up and just show this book wasn't out the last time you were here?
At the mouth of a cannon, that's from a quote from an Indian agent on the west coast of Canada near Port Alberni, and he's describing how the Indians gave up their land. They were forced to at the mouth of a cannon. And he talked about the inevitable result when a superior culture encounters an inferior one. Guess what happens? He says British Columbia is no different. It kind of, to me, encapsulates not only the issue that got me fired, but kind of like our reality in this country. I talk about what I call the octopus in that book, that triangle of business interests, government, and church that caused the genocide, grabbed the land, and really is still running the country. So, in a nutshell.
Well, I think Chairman Mao said, "Power issues from the barrel of a gun."
Yes.
And the more I think about it, that's just the way it is.
Now, I know we're going to get into this later on, but that's a perfect example of the kind of double think that we were discussing, that we kind of think of ourselves as Canadians as being kind and gentle, and we didn't just kill natives wholesale like they did in the States. We were so much better to them than that.
Yeah, we didn't put them up against a wall and shoot them generally. We infected the children with TB and never treated them. We used germ warfare rather than bullets. Although, don't forget, like any country that did genocide, Canada experienced exactly what America and other countries did, and that is, in the early phase, you wipe out 90% of the people. And the way it happened on the west coast of Canada was through the missionaries and inoculations. And that's been documented more and more. After they depopulate, then they convert the remnant. But all you ever hear about in the history books is that latter stage, when you began to convert these Indians who, there don't seem to be many of them around for some reason anymore. Right. But we now talk about the early phase because, well, it would upset the children.
Yeah. So, now, okay, so I think I can anticipate your answer, but do you think that was, it's hard to imagine that missionaries who are Christian missionaries would deliberately commit genocide. Do you think that was it a deliberate act? Was it deliberate on the part of everyone who was involved, or was it, was it ignorance? Was it maybe that people didn't know that the natives perhaps wouldn't be able to tolerate the diseases that were going to be brought in and that sort of thing?
I think if people know anything about the history of Christianity, that you'd have no problem saying, well, of course they did it, because like I often say to the few friends I still have in the Catholic Church, do a body count. You guys have killed more people than any institution in human history, and yet there's the double thing. You're worshiping the gentle Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And so how do those two things coexist? Yes, they knew what they were doing, but they didn't think it was murder. We felt it was doing it for the best reasons. That's what it's like in a genocidal system. Not only do you have a special language, like the Nazis didn't talk about extermination; they talked about relocation. They talked about relocating the populations to internment camps. They didn't talk about genocide or extermination. In Canada, we talked about assimilation, we talked about civilizing, but we didn't want to go down those dirt roads to see exactly how it was being done. Even though, the classic case, and in my book, murderbydecree.com, there's an article, the headline of the Ottawa Citizen, November 15th, 1907, describing the report of Dr. Peter Bryce, Indian Affairs doctor, where he said 2/3 of the Indian children were dying in these Indian schools because of a practice of deliberately exposing them to TB and smallpox. Natives die from white plague was the title of the article. Well, That's known on a leading Canadian newspaper on the headline 1907, yet as Noam Chomsky would say, it's all down the memory hole. It's like, why do we forget? Well, because we want to forget. We don't want to know, you know.
Well, and we pretend that we're doing them a favor by giving them anything too.
Right.
I'm reading a book called Stolen Continent, I think, right now, Stolen Continents, and it deals with the fall of 5 major civilizations in the Americas, and you can just see from the land that the Iroquois inhabited when white people came, and then these tiny little pockets that they're allowed to maintain now. And we pretend that that's great that they've got that land.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to talk about exactly how you were ejected from the church that you decided to join.
Well, I was raised in the United Church, you know, and I got ordained when I was 32 and had 2 children with my wife, Ann. And my second posting, I had worked here in Toronto actually at Fred Victor Mission down on Queen and Jarvis, and raised some hackles there because I discovered that there was all this money being laundered through the mission, and all these tenants being evicted by staff who were dealing drugs and that. And so I just wrote a letter to the board director about that, and we parted company. So for some reason, the United Church then accepted my application to go to Port Alberni, which was the center of this genocidal assault. And I often think that institutions with a lot of blood on their hands have kind of an unconscious death wish. They want this stuff to come out, but they don't have the courage to, or the chutzpah to.
Well, there's no good time to admit to genocide.
No, but
let's face it.
But maybe we'll get this guy Kevin, who's this rebel rouser, to go find it out. So sure enough, after Fred Victor Mission, I'm hired by St. Andrew's United Church in Port Alberni, summer of 1992, because they're a dying congregation. They knew I had worked for a long time in community ministry. I knew how to bring in people, and so I took the congregation from 10 to 80 people in about 6 months. And what happened was the people coming in happened to be Aboriginal, which was unusual because, still in Port Alberni, there's a real divide, white, native, and you just don't mix natives and whites in church. I mean, it just didn't happen. Remember Fred Bishop, my chair board, I went up to him at the end of the first service. I said, "Fred, I notice there aren't any Indians in the church." And he kind of looked at me like this. And
sort of like, well, of course there's
he
not.
He said, "They keep to themselves and we keep to ourselves. Everybody likes it that way, Kevin." That was his answer. So that got me curious, and I began to visit native homes. And this is in my documentary film, Unrepentant. The very first native home I went into, Danny Gus, this retired native fisherman, tells me his best friend had been killed in the Alberni school and buried in the hills out back. And he said the church people all knew about it, didn't want us in their churches, right? So, well-known fact in the native world and in the white world, but we just don't want to go there. We don't want to look at the dragon in the living room, folks. What happened, though, was that, and this is why I wrote this book, after 2 years, my local, even the kind of the reactionary element of my congregation, they liked what I was doing because I had expanded the church, and it was growing. And what clinched my fate, though, was that 2 things. I was letting survivors from the residential schools speak from my pulpit. I had an open pulpit policy, so began to hear these things. But the thing that clinched it was big money. I found out that the United Church had been selling off land that their missionaries had originally grabbed on the west coast of Vancouver Island, selling it off to one of their corporate benefactors, McMillan Blodell, who at that very time in 1994 it was the biggest corporate acquisition in British Columbia history. Weyerhaeuser in Seattle was buying up McMillan Blodell. And what was sweetening the deal was there were all these chunks of old growth forests in the possession of the church because the early missionaries had grabbed it. So the church was doing this backroom deal where they were getting the land in the hands of McMillan Blodell so they could, be bought up by Weyerhaeuser more completely. And I wrote a letter about it very naively, or however you want to describe it, stupidly, to the church, saying, wait a minute, our policy says we can't do that. We have to return native land in our possession back to the native nation that we stole it from. Another politically correct policy, I just cited it, and I figured, okay, well, they're going to say, oh my God, we forgot. We didn't look at our policy. You're right, Kevin. Okay. Instead, a series of secret meetings go on where my eviction is being planned. And this all came out later, not only in my delisting trial, defrocking. I was the only minister, proudly to say, the only minister to be publicly defrocked in United Church history at the cost of $300,000. And this all came out there and in my divorce trial because my wife left at the behest of church lawyers who approached her after she divorced me, got custody of the kids. But this all came out on the court records there, that they had planned my removal in secrecy right after I wrote that letter, and they told my congregation that I had gone crazy, and the usual kind of smear you do on a whistleblower, and I was out, and I was removed immediately without cause, without any of the provisions of the United Church Manual governing how you deal with ministers. And my congregation was full to the day I got fired. So, I mean, this whole line that I was somehow alienating people in the church, it was just created after the fact. I got an amazing, rapid education about what it means to be at the end of the receiving end of being a whistleblower up against a big corporation, because it's the same policy approach to people who are an inconvenience,
So we're talking about the church. I guess in this instance, the United Church specifically, but you also implicate the royal family and the Vatican and stuff like that. I just want to get into all
years
that.
later. Well, it's all connected, but in a nutshell, obviously this was more than just one church. It was started centuries ago, the whole policy. The Vatican and the Crown of England were the main motive forces behind the genocide. And years later, I was part of a common law court action in Brussels that indicted and convicted Queen Elizabeth, Stephen Harper, Pope Benedict, others, of these crimes against humanity. It was really irrefutable evidence. I mean, this is the really weird thing about this work. It's never been refuted. I've never been sued. It's never been contradicted. I just get attacked personally. And that's a sign of people who are caught with their pants down, and they have to distract, as any PR specialist
But
does.
who are absolutely excellent at lying. I mean, I just came, Donald Trump was given proof positive that Elizabeth Warren does in fact have Indian heritage, and his answer was, who cares? I don't care.
Right.
And
Well,
if you can pull that off, then you can continue to.
when you're in power, when you're the power, you can say anything and you're automatically believed. If you're one person against an institution, it doesn't matter what you prove, you're automatically disbelieved. Because, it's fun to talk about people liking David and Goliath battles, but they always tend to side with Goliath because they have
Well, they're scared of
power.
Goliath.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they don't think David can protect them.
No. But nevertheless, it's just what I found is the power of truth in this is that all I did year after year was I kept publishing this stuff, kept putting it out publicly. And it encouraged people with more evidence to come forward, especially survivors of these crimes. I mean, and it gets into the whole issue of how people can live with this contradictory reality in their head. How is it that half the children die every year for over 40 years, and that's been proven now? Statements in 1907 from Dr. Peter Bryce, and in 1949, both say half the children are dying every year in these so-called schools. How does that go on? I mean, because if you're operating from a good intention, as soon as children are dying at that rate, you fix it. You bring in doctors, you change the conditions, but 40 years apart, it's deliberate. And it is in fact the main way genocide happened in these places. It's germ warfare. And then the amazing, here's an anecdote. One of the fellows who's on our documentary film on Repentant, Bill Seward, said when he was taken to the United Church School in Edmonton, Christmas Eve, this minister would cart them all over to the local United Church and dress them all up, and they would sing Christmas carols for the church people, and then the church people would give them presents. The minister would then take them back and take all the presents and give them to his own kids, and then he would choose the kid he was going to rape that night, right? And he said, often these kids never came out of his room alive. We just never saw these kids again. Okay, so if you're the people sitting in the United Church that night, Christmas Eve, you're seeing these wonderful, oh, look at how we treat these Indian kids, not knowing what's going on. And really, if they heard the story of what went on, would they believe it?
Yeah.
I mean, it does sound fantastic. I mean, it just sounds unbelievable, that story.
Well, there's been enough of them out now, of those stories from eyewitnesses. And what I found when you say, how did it begin, I would meet people who never knew each other, yet they're telling the same story. I'm hearing stories of kids having their teeth pulled out. If you didn't behave and didn't sing hymns right and tried to speak your language, you wouldn't get painkiller when the dentist came. You were on a group of kids who would just have your teeth yanked without painkiller. I hear this in the healing circle that I began to work in after I was fired from the church. Then, and I reprinted this in my book, I found a document from a dentist in North Vancouver in 1924, 2 categories of children in the Squamish Residential School, those who received painkiller and those who didn't. So the document confirmed by the eyewitness, that's all you need in a court of law. But that reality hasn't broken through. We've talked around genocide in Canada. We get to 3rd stage of, quote, recovery without the first 2, which is remembering the truth and in grieving. I haven't seen any grieving. I haven't seen any tears. I haven't felt among my people any grief about this at all. Just let's forget about it and give money and apology and let's get on. You know, it's avoidance. It's what you do when you're faced with horror, right?
So what do you think it is? Is it that we have such a powerful alternate narrative about what we are? Or is it just entirely wanting to avoid knowing what happened because that means that you're culpable?
Well, we can afford to. We won the war. You know, we wouldn't know about the death camps if Germany had won the war. They would have put Churchill and Roosevelt on trial for bombing Dresden, right? You know, so we haven't had to deal with it, and so we don't have to change. People only change when they have to, really. And we can toy with humanitarian ideals and everything, but when you come right down to it, this whole so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, it's like it was set up with all the finesse of a serial killer appointing his own jury. You know, it's like the churches and government get together, decide what evidence they're going to reveal to the public. If you're a Native person and are a good little boy and girl, you can sit in front of the mic and tell your story after we've looked at it and vetted it first for any reference to a killing or anything. That's what passes for reconciliation in Canada.
Right.
They've dropped the truth word now, I've noticed. They don't talk about truth and reconciliation. It's just all reconciliation now, which is another way to say don't upset the nice feelings we have now by talking about true stories.
They really dropped...
Yeah. You just see, in every school, in every library, in the university curriculums, there's reconciliation programs, which is absurd. I mean, we haven't had truth, we haven't had war crimes, we haven't had bodies brought home, or forensic analysis done, except on this program where we showed the bones that one time from the Brantford School. But if you haven't had any of that, how can you talk about making things better? I mean, it's absurd, but I don't know.
Kevin.
Yeah.
So then what is the whole issue of the natives in Canada and all the newcomers that are here is an issue that doesn't seem to be getting any closer to being. No. I mean, we're using the word reconciliation, but I mean, what would be a real solution to that whole issue? Because we're all living here. I mean, what can we do? What is the answer?
Well, part of me, I'm divided on this. The realistic part of me says there's nothing that can be done. Because we are acting out a sickness that's been in our culture for really thousands of years. And it isn't just our culture, of course, but I mean, I think in many ways we're the epitome of it. And the other part of me says, yeah, there is possibility of change, but it's like childbirth. It's bloody and violent, and it's not, that's how something new comes to life. It's not a nice process. I remember once we were picketing outside some church in Vancouver, and the minister came out and began screaming at me, of course, not the native people, just at me. And he said, well, what is it you people want anyway? And I said, if your child was killed and thrown in a ditch somewhere, what would you want? And I suddenly put it in his framework. He said, and he looked totally shocked because he hadn't. I said, what would you want? And he said, well, don't be ridiculous. And I said, no, what would you want? And finally he said, would you want the police to investigate? Well, of course. You know,
would you want the body back?
Would you want the body back? Would you want, if the perpetrator came to you and offered money for your silence, would you take the money and an apology? Of course not. Well, you're asking that of Indians. Why should they have a separate standard of humanity than we have? But that separate standard is what we expect all the time. There's two standards all the time, our victims and ourselves. And as long as we have that, no, things won't change. And frankly, you know, Indians are still sitting on a lot of valuable real estate, a lot of resources. That fact has never changed. And the big money calls the tunes. I mean, Justin Trudeau ratified a law that Harper brought in called the Foreign Investment Protection Act, which allows China to station security forces on Canadian soil to protect their investments. I mean, it's not about sovereignty, it's not about human rights, it's about money and who's determining that. So that's our bottom line. We've proven that as a culture. So no, I don't think things are going to change unless some revolutionary developments happen, but it's got to start in here. I think we need that grassroots real change, but it's an agonizing process, and I don't find many people willing to step up to the plate with that because it's you know, Canadians were raised to think, well, we can't upset things. We don't like, I used to joke with my congregation, Jesus wouldn't get along very well in Canada because he was always dividing people. As a matter of fact, he said that all the time. I've come not to bring peace but a sword, which is what the truth is. It cuts things clearly. It divides people. It causes controversy. And anyway.
Well, I mean, sometimes I think it's like, I mean, when I look around the world, it's not just a matter even of, I mean, if there is a big power from on high, whether it's the royal family or the Vatican or whoever, some kind of elite global power, I mean, in a sense, my vibe is that they kind of used the poor, disenfranchised subjects of the European countries. You know, they took their land,
right,
and then they came here, and they used those people to take over this continent. And now, but we're all expendable.
That's a very good point. And in fact, I don't think we were even used. We did it willingly because we had been messed up back in the home country.
We were desperate for finding our way in the world where everything had been taken away.
Yeah, I mean, it's like in a family, of course, the tendency is you're harmed, you pass on the harm, right? It doesn't always happen, but it's the tendency. And to look at it, it's like you're swimming in the water. You don't even see what you're doing or what you're thinking as being wrong. And I remember hearing this all the time in the healing circles, which is I don't like using the word healing because it's got too much of a political agenda behind it. You're healed now. Have some money. Now you're fixed. Now go away. No, in these talking circles where people would tell their stories, people would never talk about the worst thing first. And they would always make excuses about the bad things that happened to them. Well, yeah, they broke my arm in residential school, but at least it was better than at home, you know. And then ultimately they say, no, it was actually worse. But as a victim, you build up all these rationalizations, levels of rationalization, and it's the doublethink we're talking about. But it isn't just the victim that does that. The victimizer does it too, because the victimizer is actually more scared than the victim. They're scared. And I've seen that in the eyes of these clergy and the people that hate me so much at these levels of church and state. I've been involved in this amazing misinfo campaign for 25 years about this whole campaign. They are so terrified of having to face the consequence really of who they are and what they've been part of. And I know it's a hard thing to do. I had to face it because I had no option. My family was taken from me. I was blacklisted. My life was destroyed, and I had to look at things because I had, there's a difference between doing something for a good intention and doing something because your life depends on it. And when you're doing something because your life depends on it, you can't have the illusion of anymore the illusions you carry. You've got to be a hard realist about everything and everyone around you. And I had to do that. And so I know I'm speaking from a different place than what even I would have understood 10 or 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was looking at me now and saying, what the hell happened to this guy, right? Is he crazy or something? But I've had these levels of kind of illusion taken away from me. And based on what I've seen, like my experience, right? And it doesn't jive with a lot of what Canadians, but that doesn't change the truth of it, right?
Yeah.
It just means that it's maybe the first step of an evolution we all have to go through.
We've got me thinking too about the incredible range of attitudes in the Native community itself.
Oh yeah.
Because when you're a victim,
Yeah.
or if you're lucky enough to not be personally affected, even if you know other people who are, sometimes you minimize for them. You tell them that they didn't have the experience
Right.
they had. So what have you seen in the Native community itself?
Oh my God. When 90% or more of your people are wiped out, no one's ever done a study on what that does. I remember the U.S. Air Force did a study after the bombing of Cambodia, and then the Khmer Rouge, where they killed off about a third of the population. This U.S. Air Force study in the late 70s said if you destroy 20% of the people, you permanently, you've destroyed their culture. They cannot function anymore. Well, we did it to 90% of the Indians on average. And the reality is, first of all, the ones who died first were the old and the young. And the old in an oral culture
Hold the legacy.
hold the knowledge. Okay, so is there a genuine indigenous culture? I don't know. I doubt it. I think people are there's some good people trying to recreate it, but it's like me saying, okay, how much do you know about your Scots-Irish heritage? Nothing really. I don't speak the language. I don't have a sense of what that spirit was, right? And I can't really point to many indigenous people that I know who have that rootedness. The ones who I have known are living off the radar, and their lives are endangered all the time. Classic case is Peter Yellowquill, my friend in western Manitoba, Anishinaabeg, and he has tried to live off reserve, refused to take Indian Affairs money, challenged the band council for dealing drugs and doing all this corrupt stuff. He's had his trailer burned, he's had his kids thrown in prison, he's on the run all the time. That's the reality if you go up against the government chiefs, who are involved in criminal activity. So there's a real division, between the traditionalists and most Native people living on the ground and the natives you're allowed to see, the Aboriginal Achievement Award receivers, the Native politicians with all the nice jewelry who speak for everybody else, but whose lifestyle has nothing to do with most Native folks. So I mean, it's as messed up as our culture, and I lost a lot of my romantic illusions about Indians a long time ago. But
now I know that you've done these things with the common law courts that you've somehow, I'm not sure what the right terminology, but you've assembled these, you've put these courts together, or you and some other people.
Well, we had to. I mean, again, it would happen through stages, and you've got to get a sense of this by. It takes. There's no 3-second soundbite on this, right? You've got to do. Put Kevin Annett in at Amazon.com. You'll see all the books. But we realized in Canada, after working with lawyers for survivors, that we weren't ever going to get the issue of genocide addressed. As a matter of fact, on 3 occasions, BC, Alberta, and Nova Scotia, I think, their Supreme Courts all ruled that the issue of genocide was beyond the competence of the courts. They weren't going to rule on it because it involves the Crown, their boss, right? So you have to go outside the country, and we did that. We went over to Europe in 2010. We tried to set up international tribunals to look into this. And we eventually brought all that evidence to a common law court in Brussels that issued a verdict which can now be enforced by any court. That's the thing about a citizen inquiry. The verdict, it's got hard evidence that any court can issue arrest warrants over. That's what has people in the church and government worried, because they know that a little bit of knowledge out there means that the whole history is going to come out, and then everything they've been seeing is going to be proved to be
So, but they
false.
still have the guns.
Yeah.
Because the common law court that you're referring to, they don't have,
enforcement.
right?
That's
They
right.
don't have the police, the army,
Right.
whoever. They don't have the official courts. the Admiralty courts, or whatever they are.
But it's like Sun Tzu says, power is not only what you have, but what your enemy thinks you have. And in this case, why did Pope Benedict and 4 other cardinals all resign when their names came out in an indictment in the record of our court? It's not accidental. It's because they know that even if everybody else doesn't know, that once their guilt comes out like that, other courts can issue arrest warrants. In fact, the Spanish government did send a note to the Vatican that they're considering issuing an arrest warrant 5 days before the guy resigned in February 2013. So it does have an impact. But if you're a small group and you have to rule everybody else, you have to live with, give people the impression that you're infallible and all-powerful. And mostly it's an illusion. Because I find, like, the perfect example of this is when we were occupying churches and the cops would show up, and you'd think, okay, they're going to bust heads, but we went right over to them, and it was a battle of hearts and minds. We said, this church has a policy, the Catholic Church has a policy of officially protecting child rapists. If you're a Catholic, you have to not tell the police when a child is raped. I said to the police sergeant many occasions, are you seriously going to protect that? We're doing nothing here but sharing information with people. You're seriously going to protect that? Because that makes you an accessory to a crime. They would either stand back and not intervene or leave every single time because they knew we were right. And they were fathers and grandfathers as well. And they knew the truth of this. So it takes long, but it's a gradual moral, you keep the moral and evidentiary high ground, and you've got a power over them that they don't know how to deal with, frankly, I think. That's been our experience.
Well, that sounds like an optimistic viewpoint.
Yeah,
I was going to say, it sounds a lot more optimistic than you were earlier.
In the sense,
I told you, I've got 2 minds on this.
that, optimistic in the sense that maybe this thing can actually come around, the truth will come out, and justice will be served. But on the other hand, I'm thinking about, I think it was Zbigniew Brzezinski said that, a couple hundred years ago, it was easier to control a million or 500 million people than it was to kill a million people. But now it's easier to kill a million people than it is to control a million people. And I'm just wondering if, things are going to get so close that the powers that be are just going to pull the pin on that global hand grenade and launch Project Bluebeam.
Well, I don't know. They haven't done it yet. I remember a friend of mine, Joe Hensby, said to me once, he was in his 70s at the time. It was like 40 years ago, and I was an up-and-coming young radical in Vancouver. And Joe was a communist longshoreman who'd been shot at by the RCMP, and he had bullet hole. He was a veteran, right? And he said, we were sitting over a beer one night, and I said, so Joe, he was all, said, you must have seen great changes in the world, Joe, since the 1930s. And he said, no, not really. I think I've done dick all to change the world, but I didn't let those bastards change me. That was his final answer at the end of a lifetime. So, maybe that's the only kind of answer we have at the end. I did what I knew was right, and I couldn't live with myself otherwise. Why the hell can more people do that? I don't think it was a great thing. It was just a necessary thing to do that. And, it comes down to that maybe.
Okay, so the new book is out at the mouth of a can. I'm just going to hold it here. People can get this on your website, right? Or links to it, or
murderbydecree.com.
Okay.
itccs.org, and Amazon. All my books are up at Amazon.
Great. Yeah. And what are you working on next?
Sequel to our documentary film Unrepentant. We're going out and looking at how this 2 aspects, how the genocide's continuing and how people are changing in response to it. Like, we want to actually go into white and Native communities and say, how has this affected you? How are you looking at Canada differently now? What kind of New Deal do you think we should have in Canada? Whether it's a republic or, severing ties with the Crown, local self-governance, all the things we talked about on the other show. How can we bring that about in our communities now? And we want to use that documentary as a catalyst. The first documentary sparked the apology and all this stuff coming out in 2007 and 8. And we're hoping this documentary will do the same kind of thing. But I've written a play, doing a lot more kind of a literary approach to this, because we it's about changing.
You gotta sneak in there, yeah.
You gotta, I hope I don't have to sneak, but I don't like sneaking. But I know what you mean. But you've got to appeal at many levels
Yeah.
about this stuff.
You got to
and
fake them out.
You got to think like Sun Tzu, art of war,
Yeah.
guerrilla warfare.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Kevin, always great to have these conversations.
Thank you.
Is there anything you want to let people know about that you didn't have a chance to say today?
Well, yeah, look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself how you're holding two contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time. That's called doublethink. It's how Big Brother tries to control us, but I actually think at the end of the day that it's not going to happen. I got ultimate hope. But based on what I've gone through and seen on the ground, not just some airy-fairy idea, but my own experience, I'm still alive, and I shouldn't be, frankly. So that's a cause for hope, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks for doing this.
Thanks, you.
Kevin. And thanks, Jen.
Great.
Thanks, Jen.
Great show today.
Yeah.
So we're going to say bye-bye. For now, we're going to go out and enjoy this beautiful sunny day here in
Yeah.
Toronto, and we'll be back tomorrow for more Liquid Lunch right here on thatchannel.com.